So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce to you the third keynote speaker, and that is Mr. Huang Ping. He has a very long, impressive list of titles, such as a senior research professor and the Director General of the Institute of European Studies, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, or CAS, the China CEEC Think Tank Network President, and the China CEE Institute. He also serves as the President of Chinese Association of American Studies, as well as the Vice President of the China National Association of International Relations, Vice President of Chinese Association of World Politics Studies, as well as a board member of the United Nations Research Institute of Social Development. So please welcome Mr. Huang Ping. He will be speaking to us on social futuring studies for the 21st century, why and how.
Thank you so much. It is really my great honor to be invited, also to share, firstly actually to listen to the very distinguished speakers. I have actually enjoyed so much from their very enlightening lectures. Let me see. About half a year ago when I was here, I heard for the first time about the social futuring by colleagues who are here. I was immediately delighted. Simply, when I was young, I began also from philosophy, Western philosophy, later on Chinese. And then for most of my years, academic years, I was a sociologist doing development, including poverty, migration, those issues. In those years, we called the developing societies, or even earlier, third world, how those countries, including China, but not only China, can actually, let me see, catching up. Firstly, catch up with Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and then finally, hopefully, the so-called West, Europe and North America. So as a sociologist, I worked with those organizations like UNDP, Food and Agriculture Organization, UNESCO, and some smaller one like UNICEF for children, and the IFAD, International Fund for Agriculture, for the very rural communities. Some of them were not nation states yet. After some years of working with such organizations, as well as the World Bank or ADB, Asian Development Bank, in those years, people emphasized so much on development, or let me say growth, or GDP income measured by. And as one of the, in those years, quite a small number of sociologists, together with some anthropologists, we began to realize, especially for those societies, third world societies, developing societies, it's quite hard, actually, for them to catch up. Technically, you can easily list, because lack of infrastructure, lack of education, lack of donation, aid from outside, etc., etc. But beyond these technical sort of reasons, there are very sort of deep reasons for their social, cultural, let me say, situations or differences. Therefore, the UNDP, together with some other brother organizations, invited us to try to add some social dimensions for development, we fully recognize how important for those societies and people living in those societies income is GDP, how important GDP growth. But in the meantime, either by statistics or by very sort of case studies, anthropological sort of participatory observations, we realize, for instance, first, education, second, health, are actually so important. Even amongst these societies themselves, the differences between, say, gender, between cities and rural areas, between the coastal and the very remote mountainous communities, and between the majority and minorities. So this was how I began with the so-called social approach to development, instead of only looking at the economic growth. But it's quite true still, economy is the key. And I have worked perhaps more with economists than sociologists. And in recent years, I also began a kind of cultural, actually already more than 30 years, cultural, more than just intercultural dialogues, which the UNESCO launched in 1945, just after the war. But how different cultures can communicate and share with a kind of reciprocal knowledge, which I began when I was actually 30 years ago. I was still relatively young, with one of the European leading scholars who only recently, unfortunately, passed away, Roberto Eco, who had an idea about transculturality, to see how we may get another chance if we have missed 300 or 200 years ago during an enlightenment or during before that period of time, to develop this so-called reciprocal knowledge. Since I began with philosophy, I also have had chances and opportunities to discuss such issues, even recently, with people like Jürgen Habermas. I remember he had a small but very important, interesting collection of his interviews. The book title was "The Past as the Future." So it's actually quite difficult to foresee or to know our future, either social future or other types of futures. But in order to understand what is going on and what may take place in the future, either near future or the future in 20, 30, 40 years, we need to go back to our history, back to the past. So I'm so glad to listen for all the previous speakers, all began with their history and also the current challenges. Therefore, for me, there is no need to repeat what you have just emphasized. But I like to come still, if we try still use a key word like modernity, enlightenment is the key period, time, or event. And if not entirely true as Roberto Eco argued, then we missed each other after Leibniz to develop this type of reciprocal knowledge. But it is the Enlightenment during which we had a kind of intellectual approach to the relationship between nature and human beings. And we thought we can control, we can win. So this develops a kind of bilateral approach to this very important, perhaps most important relationship, how human beings actually, as part of nature, can separate, then finally control this nature. As a consequence of this kind of intellectual approach, I have argued for or against. We have also the similar approach to the West and the rest, the past and the future, the goodness and badness, etc., etc. Secondly, I like to jump to the era, the post-Cold War. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we, for a very short period of time, actually during that period of time I was either in Europe or in the United States. For a very short period of time, it was Fukuyama's argument at the end of history was so sort of welcomed. Then Samuel Huntington's Clashes of Civilizations. But nowadays we all see maybe it's not the end of the history, but the end of the knowledge or the world as we know it. This again back to the Enlightenment and then the 18th, 19th century when social science began with. Whatever disciplines we belong to with in those years, since Francis Bacon, Immanuel Kant, the most sophisticated and perhaps still the most enlightening philosopher to us, had such a confidence that by learning and by knowing, suddenly we will get the certainty. But after, I think it's the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the short period of time, we realized nowadays we are very certain, or the only so-called certainty is uncertainty. So we are very certain that everything is uncertain, with full of risks, crisis, chaos, so-called fragmentation of the modernity. When I say this, I do not mean the very concrete so-called refugee crisis, Ukraine problem of Crimea, debt crisis, etc. These are all true, but I mean fundamentally, this kind of knowledge, or for certain certainty of this type of knowledge, actually has had a kind of real challenge from this very fragmented, to a certain extent, instead of so-called the integration, but a more disintegrated world. Not only in terms of one continent or to another, like European integration, which was or used to be and may still be to the great extent the example for African integration, Asian cooperation, etc., regional. But the nation state itself also has had such challenges because we all had nation states. But as the map you have just showed, the fundamental differences amongst nation states, also even, as English says, the size matters. So some nations that are huge in the United States, Russia, China, India, as a continent, the economy, and a kind of some with a very long continued history, some have not. But other, even in the same, not only in name, but the same formation of such nation state, they have to find ways to survive, either relying on the great powers or locally, regionally be more integrated. Even in order to achieve so, they will have to if not give up, but have to contribute some of their used to be the national interest sovereignty, etc., to a larger regional organization such as the EU. Then for social sciences, if it's possible, necessary, for us still be social science to know the world, what is going on nowadays with such uncertainty and full of crises. No mentioning of even without such chaos, crisis, challenges, there are always so many so-called unintended consequences. So even back to the small cases when I began in the early 80s, my career, those so-called development issues, gradually more opportunities, along with the globalization, along with the international corporations, those minorities, those remote communities got more and more chances. But again, one of the most important unintended consequences is the problem of environment, energy, water, finally the whole ecological problem. Nowadays we use the term climate change. Actually it's more than just climate change. Climate change is already the result. Another, of course, non-traditional, let's say, but a security challenge, but a non-traditional security challenge is so-called extremists, with or without religious backgrounds. They do not form themselves, those extremists, as a nation state, but they challenge the whole system, order. This was true from the 9/11s. When that took place, I was in New York. But also true nowadays everywhere, in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well, even in China. So this is another type of challenge which was not from the traditional, even I shared so much from George Friedman's, not only today's, but your previous writing, is still such one of the most, always at the top booksellers in China. The geopolitics, geoeconomies, those are still one of the keys for us to understand the world and to understand maybe tomorrow and the near future. But these non-traditional challenges came from the non-state actors. Of course, some are quite negative, quite even positive. Transnational corporations, for instance, powerful on the one hand, on the other hand, they are not nation states. But Davos nowadays is more influential than the UN annual conference. I have many colleagues in the States, either academics or some think tanks, some are even worked with the government, and they came to me many times, very seriously, why you Chinese are so serious about the UN? You see nowadays, Davos, actually, even Chinese president recently, last year, went there, made an important speech. He made also another speech, I think it's also quite important in Geneva UN headquarters, but people always just listen to his speech at the Davos. And many NGOs, some NGOs only for environment, only for gender, women, for minorities, but they are not so active as well. So in terms of also actors, many are no more nation states or non-state actors became more and more influential. So along with this kind of so-called fragmentation of the modernity, or so someone uses post-modernity, how the social studies, if not social science, but social studies, today social future studies, be possible and be necessary. I think the more uncertain the world is, the more necessary for people like us to seriously, of course with a perhaps more comprehensive approach, instead of either very binary approach or only one disciplinary, one-dimensional approach. And it's not enough to do so by the so-called interdisciplinary. About 15 years ago, I think, 15 years ago, after the UNESCO's 50th anniversary, 1995, the UNESCO, for the first time, invited social scientists, in total 10 from all over the world, 10 social scientists, to do a so-called external assessment of the UNESCO's whole scientific program since 1945. I was one of them. We did 5 years, from 1995 to the end of the last century. We submitted the report. One of the conclusions was the division of labor within UNESCO, and behind the knowledge we have had based on the disciplinary approach, economists, sociologists, political scientists, geographers, etc., etc., are no more the case for nowadays world. Because the world itself has been so, if in a positive term, integrated, in a sort of another term, so complicated. But division of intellectual work since the 18th century, we thought by knowing one part of it, finally we can know the whole body of the society. But nowadays, this kind of multidisciplinary approach, and even by, again, Roberto Eco, he argues a kind of transdisciplinary approach to understand the complex of the world. This is partly true, but it's so hard. That's why I think the program you launched, so for the social future, which obviously, I think the rector also you have listed already the framework, analytical framework, which to a great extent I fully shared. Ecological, environmental, socio-economic, cultural, and technological dimensions. But again, how these different dimensions can be worked in such a comprehensive manner, then we will understand current, the past, and the future situation. Whatever unintended consequences, events, policies. When I'm traveling to Budapest, transferred at the Helsinki last night, I heard the news. Donald Trump, the president, has signed the tariff, this time against China, and he said only the first. But he said so many countries had this kind of unfair economic or trade relationship with the USA. But this is partly the geopolitics, geoeconomics, but partly, again, to see how uncertain, not because the individual politician or leaders of this one country or another, but how this capital flow, I remember when I was working with the World Bank, that was the 1980s. Capital flow already took place in the United States, but in those years to Mexico first, then Latin America, and gradually to Southeast Asia, Japan, South Korea. And it landed into mainland China was already 1995. So it's very structural instead of policies or someone had a very bad intention to steal the capital and therefore the job vacancies. But these challenges need to call for really a kind of alternative approach, comprehensive, multidisciplinary, or even transdisciplinary, and with real intellectual continuity, even since ancient time. Combined not only, again, from the so-called Western philosophy or wisdom, but this is also one of my colleagues, actually young colleagues. When I knew him, he was early 20s. Now perhaps like Chen Xin, early 40s now. He published a book, actually now there's already 5 books, but the first one was early tiny. It's called All Under the Heaven, the ancient Chinese philosophy before Confucius. How this can be an alternative for the 21st century, the old order, even alternative to Immanuel Kant's philosophy for peace. The main idea is all under the heaven. That means we are different, but we are all under the heaven. So we share this one, or the only one earth, part of nature, and we are all here. The difference with the so-called peace with differences. Because we are different, therefore we can achieve the peace. Instead of we have to be the same, then we enjoy the peace. So for me, I think the two diversities are quite fundamental. One is biological, biodiversity, another is cultural diversities. But with these two fundamental bases, it's not enough. These are necessary for human beings to have a good life, let's say, with meaning and quality of life, community relationship. But differences are the very natural phenomena. So differences themselves are not enough. Necessary but not enough. So how different cultures, different countries, different peoples, different geopolitical or geoeconomic situations can live together, dealing with those challenges, as I mentioned, is non-traditional but seriously, or getting more serious and everyday into our everyday life. From climate change to another type of, let's say, extremist approach to the old order. This will, I think, bring about the real chances for a group of social scientists organized by your university in this framework for the social future. I like the social future, the term. Even actually, social does not mean the very conventional sociological approach, but much more comprehensive. Also, I like the futuring because it's a program with full of the input by agents, people, instead of something over there as a law of the nature. And thirdly, I think what is also going on in the rest of the world, not only in the West, is so fascinating nowadays. China, for instance, size is there, population is there, development. But next to China, already there and will be more obvious is India. actually, after the Second World War, first non-Western society was Japan. But Japan, in terms of size, even still one of the big countries, but we would consider Japan was at most the medium size. But Japan first, China second, if India third. So the whole geopolitics, even we say the whole world, for 300 years, I would say, will be so different from what we know, what we have seen. Therefore, the social future for either individuals, communities, countries, either nation state or not, and groups of countries, is really one of the new tools, new approach to understand. Even, of course, by the end, the philosophers, either in ancient Greece or ancient China, or always argue, the more you know, the less you say. Thank you. Thank you.